I think the content of this talk, as you can see, is living without the law. The speaker is Ralph Critchfield here on my left. I don't think there's really much more of an introduction to give, so over to you.
Well, Comrade Chair and comrades, I don't know whether the idea has got around that the Socialist Party is holding a weekend stall here this weekend about living without the state. I didn't observe any signs of any great sort of moral deprivation as I came to Oxford to get here, because what strikes me is that to talk about living without the state is talking to people about living without something which is generally regarded as pretty essential in modern society, the state being seen as something which is really quite benign and almost parental. For example, in the recent election for the leadership of the Labour Party, all the three candidates put themselves forward as prospective Prime Ministers who, if they ever got into number 10, will make sure that they manage the state machine in British capitalism as something which is benign and which bestows all sorts of benign things upon us. So if we talk about living without the state, we're telling people we're going to live without something which is necessary in their lives and which is protective and progressive. And that also applies to this thing called the law, which I'm supposed to be talking about today. And of course the law is an essential adjunct of the state. But again, people regard the law in very much the same way. If you were to get on that omnibus in Clapham and ask anybody, what do you think about living without the law? They'd say, my God, if there wasn't the law, everybody in this bus would be fighting each other, nobody would be paying any fares, they'd smash up the bus would never get where it's supposed to go, and so everybody would be thoroughly dissatisfied. So the law is also regarded as something benign and necessary because it's supposed to keep order. It stops people walking along the street and having fights and stealing things, so it protects property, and it also cares for the vulnerable people in society. It cares for children and old people and sick people and all the rest of it. Now, another assumption that goes with the idea that the law is necessary in society is that it imposes a type of higher morality in our lives. The law is something which, if we all stick to, then life is going to be much more orderly, it's going to be much better, and we ourselves are going to be operating in a much more efficient way. There is something which you've all heard of called justice, which is supposed to be the implementation of the law, and justice is supposed to be something which is impartial and fair, and is supposed to assess a particular event, decide who's responsible for something happening, and then if necessary punish somebody or award somebody else according to the principles of this so-called justice. So the assumption is that without that sort of law, without that sort of organisation, without justice, we're going to have a pretty chaotic sort of society. Now, this was expressed by a man, you must all have heard of him, I think he's Lord Donaldson now, but at the time he was just Sir John Donaldson. And he was chairman of the National Industrial Relations Court, which was a thing set up by the Heath government in the 70s in order to administer the anti-trade union laws which they introduced. And Donaldson mucked the job up, really, because he took the law seriously. And as a result of that, we'll come to Judge's sort of political function in a bit, I suppose, but he took it seriously. He looked at the law and said you may remember there were some dockers, and there eventually got to be 5 dockers who were defying the anti-trade union laws passed by the Heath government. And Donaldson said, I'm a judge, so if these people have broken the law, I'm going to put them in prison. And the Heath government said, my God, we didn't really mean this to happen. So they found somebody called the official solicitor, who had never been heard of by any reasonable, normal people up to that date, and has never been heard of since, as far as I know. But they said to this guy, the official solicitor, who was probably astounded that anybody was ever going to make use of his services, that he had to go along to Pentonville Prison and somehow get these dockers out of prison. But being a civil servant and probably sort of comfortably paid, he went along and he did it, and the 5 dockers came out. But in sending them to prison, this is what Donaldson said. He said, by their conduct, these men are saying they are above the rule of law. No court should ignore such a challenge. To do so would imperil all law and order. Now that's a fairly common sort of statement which you expect to hear from judges and politicians and magistrates and people like that. But what Donaldson is saying there is that the worst possible prospect is that there will be a breakdown of law and order. So if these 5 dockers did this, there will be like a virus spreading out from Pentonville Prison, and in the end the whole of society will be deprived of law and order, and there will be no protection for anybody, there will be no points of reference for anybody to organise their lives. And that's a fairly common attitude towards the law. Now what the law is, in fact, is that it is a state-imposed definition of certain relationships arising from the property basis of society. It defines relationships between individuals, and in individuals I also count corporations, companies and organisations like that, and it also defines the relationships between the individuals and the state. And all of these balance on the basic fact of capitalist society that there are property rights in existence, that there is a class monopoly of the means of wealth production and distribution, and all the superstructure of society arises from that. It follows then that if we remove the property rights from society, if we have a society with a different basis, then we don't have to have the laws which we live under today. And the reason that people may regard the proposition that we live in a society in future without laws, they would regard that with horror, is that they would say that there are no standards of morality, therefore, and that behaviour would not be defined. So, if we could look first of all at the business about the standards of morality, because the law is supposed to represent, isn't it, as I said before, a higher morality. There is an assumption that if we are this thing called law-abiding, then we live by a certain moral code which enables us to exist peacefully and efficiently and in cooperation with other human beings. Now, in fact, of course, the morality which the law applies is not something which is fixed and unchanging. It's something which varies according to the requirements of capitalist society at any one particular time. A fairly trivial example of this is something that I can remember, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of reminiscences from my childhood. It was a very interesting childhood I had, but some other time. I can remember that when I was a kid, one of the things which the law said was illegal and therefore immoral was something called off-course betting. If you wanted to put some money on a horse, you had to go to a race course to do it, or you had to have an account with a bookmaker. Well, of course, there were millions of members of the working class who tried to enliven their very drab and impoverished lives by putting just a few pence on a horse. But they weren't enabled to do that. So there were people called bookies runners, and they used to live all over the place. So if my parents wanted to put some money on a horse, they used to give it to me or some other member of my family in a tightly wrapped up piece of paper, and I used to slink along the street looking out for the police, because what I was doing and what that man was doing, whose house I used to take the bet to, was illegal. And the police used to expend an enormous amount of energy in trying to catch these people. They were always raiding this man's house looking for these bets, and on the occasions that they found him, they used to drag him into court, because he was doing something illegal and therefore immoral. But suddenly that situation changed, and as you know, that is no longer illegal. Kids don't have to scurry along the streets now taking bets to bookies runners. There are betting shops where people can go and do this. So that's an example of the morality of the law changing in a particular direction, something being decriminalised. And in the other direction, at one time it was moral for anybody who lived in this thing that used to be called the British Empire or the British Commonwealth of Nations. It was perfectly moral and legal for them to come quite freely into this country. And again, another chunk of my childhood, I can remember in the regular lessons we used to have about the glory of the British Empire, being told that one of its great moral influences in the world was the fact that it was this family of nations, and that anybody could move around within the British Empire, that anybody could come from India or Canada or Australia or wherever, the Fiji Islands, they could come quite freely into this country, and that was presented as something which was highly moral. But then in 1962, for particular political reasons, that was seen as something which was politically inconvenient, and so we had the first Commonwealth Immigration Act. And the restrictions which were imposed under that Act have progressively been tightened up over the years by Labour governments as well as Tory governments. And so now we get the situation where it is immoral for people to come illegally into this country. Unless they come under the correct legal definitions, then they are hunted down by the police, subjected to some extreme treatment, and it is quite, and certainly to organise it is regarded as an extremely serious offence for which people will go to prison for quite a long time. Another example of that developing trend will be seen in the new Criminal Justice Act. You've probably seen that, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, there was a demonstration in London against the provisions of this Act in which things which have hitherto been quite legal and therefore moral are going to be held to be illegal and therefore immoral. Another assumption about the law is that it not only imposes a higher morality, but that it also punishes people who breach that morality. It punishes people who do things which are forbidden under the law. But again, when we look at the reality of this situation, we find that it just isn't so. I know you're all pretty familiar with cases like the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, and certain associated offences which arose from bombing incidents and other similar things committed by the IRA. And you all know, of course, that what was quite clearly established in all of those cases was that there was severe malpractice by the police. What happened was that the police were under a lot of pressure to arrest people quickly for these incidents, so they weren't too bothered about the strength of the evidence. They just grabbed hold of people who seemed to be convenient, and they then beat them up until they made some sort of confession for the offences, and other evidence was also bent, and eventually these people ended up doing very, very long prison sentences. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, and they served sort of 15, 16, 17 years before eventually the thing collapsed and they were let out of prison. Now, there was an inquiry recently into the case of the Guildford 4, which you've also probably heard about, chaired by a man called Sir John May, who used to be a judge in the appeal court and who was generally considered to be a judge of independent mind. Now, he said about the Guildford 4 case, in his report, he said that the system was perfectly okay. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the system that allows people to be picked up and beaten up and subsequently sentenced to long terms in prison for something which they hadn't done, and which everybody knew they hadn't done. In fact, in the case of the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, if you talk to anybody who was familiar with them in prison or out of prison, everybody, including the police, were absolutely sure that these people hadn't done this. But the Sir John May inquiry said there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. What had happened was that there were one or two individual failings. Well, Lord Lane, who was not, who at the time was Lord Chief Justice, and who wasn't famous for his liberal and lenient attitude towards people who came in front of him, and who certainly dealt pretty harshly with any appeals which he thought challenged the legal system, when the Guildford 4 were eventually set free by the appeal court in 1989, he said that what's quite obvious in this case is that the police have lied, and so the police officers concerned, these individuals, should be prosecuted, and he hoped that this should be pretty soon. Well, that was in 1989, and 4 years later they got those police in the dock, and inevitably it seemed they were acquitted. So the individuals that Sir John May had put the finger on here said that there were individual failings. Individuals had twisted things, had bent along, behaved in an unacceptable way. Nothing happened to them. They weren't punished. So in other words, this is an example, and there are plenty more, where the people who are responsible for breaking the law are not in fact punished. Another example which is quite interesting was the case of the defendants in the Guinness trial. You may remember these were some people who were pretty rich people who in fact stole quite a lot of money, and it doesn't matter to me who they stole it from. I couldn't care less if they steal money from each other, but they did, and I wasn't sure the way they did it. It was all connected with some sort of share deal, and since I don't own shares and I'm not likely to, it's of absolutely no interest to me. There was a man called Ernest Saunders who was in charge of Guinness at the time, and he masterminded the whole thing, and he was responsible for stealing millions and millions of pounds. Now, if you go along and you manage to steal, say, £20,000 from your employer on Monday and you're caught, you'll get a substantial prison sentence, and you'll start off serving that prison sentence in a closed prison where conditions are pretty grotty, and you'll move very slowly through the system, and towards the end of your sentence you'll go to an open prison. That's the way the system works. But Ernest Saunders, having stolen millions and millions of pounds, got just 5 years, and almost overnight he was sent to an open prison, Ford in Sussex. I don't really know, it's sort of near the seaside, and it's really quite pleasant. Something like this, actually. It's flat, and the people there are just as nice as you lot as well. They're a lot cleverer than some of us, but still. Anyway, Ernest Saunders was sent down to Ford, and he sort of wandered around in the sunshine for a bit, and then suddenly the Home Office said, Ernest Saunders has got Alzheimer's disease. Well, Alzheimer's disease, as you probably know, is a degenerative condition, and there is no cure for Alzheimer's disease. So the Home Office said, well, we've got to be nice to this guy. He's got this dreadful disease. So we let him out. Never mind about the fact that there are thousands of people in prison who aren't like Ernest Saunders, who do have dreadful diseases. One of the Guildford Four, for example, was dying of tuberculosis and died in prison, in fact, and the Home Office did nothing about him. But they said Ernest Saunders has got Alzheimer's disease, so we must let him out. And promptly when he got out, he had this miraculous cure of Alzheimer's disease, which has never been known before and is at the moment medically impossible. The point was, of course, that Ernest Saunders was let out because he wasn't just like a member of the working class who'd stolen some money from his employer. So this again is an example of how the law and the legal system works in a particular way. And I don't want to make too much of this point, having gone on about it for a very long time, because having said all that, as I'm going to say in a bit, it really is quite irrelevant. Now the point about the law, and it didn't, perhaps I'm a bit naive, it didn't strike me until I started to read up stuff for this meeting, quite how all-pervasive the law is. From the moment you're born, the law comes into operation. There are laws about your parentage, the property that you might have or might not have, your parentage and the obligations of your parents and your education, all the rest of it. And that goes on all through your life. There are masses and masses of laws until the point when you die, and there are laws about how you're going to be certified as dead and what's going to happen if you've got a bit of money or something like this. And there's criminal law, there's property law, there's laws of contract, which don't bother me. There are laws about negotiable instruments, you have bills of exchange and cheques and things like that, and there's public order law, and it goes on and on and on. And of course there are volumes and volumes written about this sort of thing. And as the laws develop, they repeal or modify other laws. For example, the present Public Order Act, which is in operation, until this new one comes in operation, these are 3 acts. I chose these because of their particularly blood-curdling titles. It repeals completely 3 acts: the Tumultuous Petitioning Act of 1661. Now, you didn't know that up to 1984 you could have offended the Tumultuous Petitioning Act of 1661, did you? And the Shipping Offences Act of 1793 and the Seditious Meetings Act of 1817. And it partly repealed other things like the Vagrancy Act, which is beloved of courts, beloved of magistrates' courts in particular, because they can get people into court under all sorts of pretences under the Vagrancy Act of 1824. And it also partly repealed the Erith Tramways and Improvement Act, and I could go on and on like this. Now, I only say this because, and I'm going to come on this, there's a huge industry of people who train extensively and who spend all their lives tracing these laws and what's repealed by what and how to write a law so that the Erith Tramways and Improvements Act is repealed properly. It's not repealed improperly, because otherwise people in Erith on the tramways might get mixed up about something. But of course, at the same time as there are laws, there are other laws which say how those laws must be applied. There are Magistrates' Courts Acts, for example. And there is something called the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which lays down the procedure that the police are supposed to follow, and when they get you into court, about the powers of the court. And again, there's this enormous industry of people dealing with this sort of thing. I came across an example of this just a little while ago. I was whiling away a morning, so I was in a court, so I went and sat in this court, where a firm was being prosecuted for mucking around with a tachograph, a transport firm, being prosecuted for mucking around with the tachographs on its lorries. Now, you know the regulations about tachographs, they're designed to stop or to modify the possibility of lorry drivers working overtime, falling asleep at the wheel and ploughing into a bus queue or something like this. So it's not a bad idea, is it? And I guess if I was a lorry driver, I wouldn't want to work long hours until I was keeling over the steering wheel. And this firm was prosecuted for mucking around with its tachographs. Now, in this court, there were 2 barristers and 2 solicitors, and they had their clerks, and there were the court officials, and there was a stipendiary magistrate who, as you know, is a qualified lawyer who's paid to be a magistrate, all sitting there, and this argument went on and on and on about this firm and the tachographs. Now, the interesting thing was that nobody contested the fact that this firm had mucked around with the tachograph. What was being contested was whether the prosecution had been brought under the correct part of the Road Transport Act. And this stipendiary was really enjoying this, because this is what he's good at, you see. He's very clever. He knows, and he was quoting this act and the subsections, and they were all leaping up. And I listened to this for an hour, and it had gone on long before I got there, and it was going to go on for a long time after I left. Now, that is an example of this industry that I'm talking about. These people are like people on a production line. You go into a factory and you see people bent over machines, and the oil and the heat and the noise and the metal coming. They were just like people on a production line. They had this enormous knowledge, and they were very wrapped up in what they were doing, and they probably went home at night thinking they'd done a thoroughly good job. I don't know what happened to the firm or what happened to the prosecution. Lord Denning once, you may have heard of Lord Denning. I'm going to come back to him later on, because I always had, I don't know about you, I had favourite members of the capitalist class, favourite members of the ruling class who irritate me or amuse me, and Lord Denning used to be my favourite judge. He was preceded by a man called Lord, I'm not sure whether, he was Lord Chief Justice, his name was Goddard, wasn't he, who used to love sentencing people to death, and used to go through a sort of sexual experience every time he sentenced people to death. And he looked very gruesome as well. But Lord Denning, he used to be Master of the Rolls. As you know, judges always have to have funny names, and the fact that he was called Master of the Rolls didn't mean to say that he worked for Mother's Pride Bakery, turning out particular types of bread. I don't know what Master of the Rolls means, except that he's in charge of the Court of Appeal. And Lord Denning was supposed to be a man who ran the Court of Appeal on the basis of common sense. But having read quite a lot of what he's written, having listened to it and sort of followed his career for a while with interest, common sense seemed to be the last thing that ever sort of got through his brain. But he was talking about this business about the industry of the law, and he said not a single page. He talks about 3 volumes. This was in 1970. I'm sure they're much more than 3. 3,000 pages each of interpretation of the statute. So if you want to know what the statutes are about, you've got to read 9,000 pages of it. And he says not a single page, it's not even straightforward then, when you've read it, he says not a single page, but it can give rise to argument. So if you're going to sit there arguing about 9,000 pages, every page, 9,000 pages, he says books and books have been written on the interpretation of statutes. Now he likes this, thinks it's great, but of course what it is, it's an enormous waste of human effort, and it's an enormously inefficient society that operates in that sort of way. And even after that, we do get these things called miscarriages of justice. Even after the 9,000 pages have been read and argued about and interpreted, we still get those miscarriages of justice. Now, a guy called Lord Kilmuir, who was Lord Chancellor under Macmillan, who was sacked actually by Macmillan on that occasion where he sacked everybody who happened to be walking down 10 Downing Street that day. There was a programme about it recently on TV, wasn't there? And Lord Kilmuir was very bitter because he thought he'd done an excellent job as Lord Chancellor. He said that a wrongful conviction for murder, after the processes of a trial and appeal and House of Lords, all these sort of fail-safe mechanisms, was in the realms of fantasy. But of course we know it's not in the realms of fantasy, because people are convicted wrongfully of murder. I talked about the Birmingham Six, but there's so many other examples as well. There was that man called Stefan Kisko, who wasn't a member of the IRA, who was convicted of the sexual murder of a small child. And the significant thing was that at the time of his arrest, there was actually in the hands of the police material scientific evidence which showed that the man could not possibly have done this. But this didn't stop the guy being convicted of murder, and had there been a death penalty, of course he would have been executed. And he then spent something like 14 years, I think, in prison, and because of his offence he had an extremely rough time. And when he came out, he didn't last very long. He died of a heart attack. So this is the reality of what Lord Kilmuir said was pure fantasy. And of course, underneath the publicised cases, there are lots and lots of people who aren't convicted of murder, convicted of lesser offences through the same sort of mechanism. Now, why does this sort of thing happen? Why is it that so many people are wrongfully convicted? There was a survey of a prison called Long Lartin down in Worcestershire. It is Worcestershire. Yeah, it is Worcestershire. It's near Evesham, Long Lartin. And something like just under a third of the prisoners there, it was considered, had serious grounds for questioning the basis of their imprisonment. So why does all this happen? Well, why is it that when these things happen, and if they're publicised, nothing is done as a result of it? Well, coming back to Lord Denning, he was talking... he was giving a judgment in a case, I think it was in the theatre, where the union was trying to restrict employment. And what he said about that in giving his judgment, as an aside, he said, "Let no one say that in this we are prejudiced. We have but one prejudice, that is to uphold the law, and that we will do whatever befalls. Nothing shall deter us from doing our duty." Now, that was what he was saying in 1977. When he came to give a judgment on the Birmingham Six, who were taking an action actually against the police, they first of all tried to get some prison officers convicted of beating them up in prison. When that failed, that indicated that the injuries they had when they arrived at prison must have been caused by the police, so they took an action against the police. And this is what Denning said about this, and this was in 1980. He said, just consider the course of events if this action is allowed to proceed. If the 6 men win, that's the Birmingham Six, it means that the police were guilty of perjury. They were guilty of violence and threats, that the confessions were involuntary and were improperly admitted in evidence, in other words, that the court and the judges also are told, and that the convictions were erroneous. That would mean the Home Secretary would either have to recommend they be pardoned or he would have to remit the case to the Court of Appeal. This is such an appalling vista that every sensible person in the land would say it cannot be right that these actions should go any further. Now, what Denning is saying is that whether these blokes are guilty or not, whether they've got a case against the police or not, if we admit that, that is an appalling vista. We're saying there are going to be all sorts of consequences would follow from that, which we are going to find highly inconvenient. And that really is the reason that these things are carried on and are supported. Denning, in fact, when the guilty plea were released, he said, I'm sorry, I went a bit over the top there, or words to that effect. But of course he's a bit late then, they've been in prison for another 11 years. So what he's saying there is that really the law is very essential to capitalist society, and that whether it operates as they present it to us, then it must be assumed to operate correctly within their terms, and it can't be challenged. And that is because the law does assert property rights, and because it protects the privileges of capitalist society, so it must be seen to be effective. And as Denning said, if it is proved that the police and the court, and he even mentioned the Home Secretary at the time, didn't he? If they're involved in any of this, then the law becomes in disrepute, the whole system is seriously challenged, and we get what Denning called this appalling vista. And beside that sort of prospect, what really did the lives of 6 people matter? 6 members of the working class who might spend 15, 16, 17 years in prison. Put in the balance, of course, they don't count for very much. Now, Denning himself, and I think this is the last time I'm going to quote this man, he talked about the function of the court. This was in 1952, and he said, a man's right to work. Now, one of the things about Lord Denning is that for most of the time, judging by what he said and he wrote, he lived in a world where women didn't exist, because he was always talking about men's rights and how men behave. He says a man's right to work is just as important to him, if not more important, than his rights of property. These courts intervene every day to protect the rights of property. They must also intervene to protect the rights to work. What he was talking about was this is a common argument about protecting the rights to work. They were talking about the case where a trade union was trying to restrict recruitment into an industry. And this case, this point about the rights to work, is always brought out in that sort of situation. Now, of course, trade unions don't have very much clout, so they can't work in the closed shop. And it's also brought out if trade unionists start picketing. It's never brought out, nobody ever mentions this so-called right to work when workers are made redundant. That's considered to be absolutely acceptable. No judge ever gets up and says these people are being made redundant, but they have a right to work, so the firm can't sack them. It's considered to be absolutely acceptable. But Denning there indicated quite clear that they protect, the courts are there really to protect the rights of property. And if we see the legal system as something which is not operating as it's supposed to do, that is an aspect of the fact that we live in a decadent society which can't fulfil human needs. It's a society in which corruption is very often an acceptable way of organising affairs, and the law is not above this. Now, the response to this sort of situation, the response of the reformists, is to say that we have to improve the legal system. There's a move at the moment, for example, and this is being bitterly resisted, of course, to stop judges and barristers wearing wigs and gowns in court to make them look like ordinary human beings. And if you read any analysis of cases like the Birmingham Six and the Guildford Four, at the end of it, the people who were involved in exposing these cases always come up with the idea of reforming the law, so that the law will work a bit more efficiently, and we won't have the possibility of these so-called miscarriages of justice. But of course, we as socialists aren't going to be concerned with reforming the law at all, with making one or two adjustments so that judges are differently dressed or sit in different types of places. They don't. If you go to the Old Bailey, you'll see the judges sort of sitting halfway up in space, and this doesn't exactly encourage any confidence when you're talking to them. We're talking about a society in which the legal system doesn't exist, that there aren't laws at all. And the opposition to this, if you were going to get onto the omnibus in Oxford or wherever and talk to people about wanting a society in which laws don't exist, there will be this shock horror reaction. It will be based on the assumption that human beings need external controls, that we don't have internal controls. We don't assess situations and make judgments in terms of human interests and cooperation, that we have to have this vast legal machinery outside which tells us what to do, how to get on a bus, how to play the fair, how to go to work, how to behave, not to start fighting in the streets and things like that. And that without those external controls, we'll run riot, there will be public disorder, we'll deal with any problems in an antisocial way. Now, this, of course, is part of the argument about so-called human nature, which assumes that although human beings can esteem themselves, although that's a matter of personal pride, supposedly, and although they can esteem themselves as part of a nationality, people are supposed to be proud to be British or proud to be French or something. That's called patriotism and is highly valued and esteemed. But what human beings mustn't do is to have regard for themselves as a species, to say that the human species is useful and behaves in acceptable and cooperative ways. That's, if you put that point of view, that we could have a society based on human cooperation, you're considered to be naive. Humans are assumed to be competitive and never cooperative, and they assume that they can never have any real stake in society. They have got to be continually alienated against society. Now, presumably we'll discuss this a bit more later on, but at the moment what we can say is that if this concept of human beings were true, then it's very unlikely that we would have developed to the point at which we have today. Human beings would not have built this sort of society which we have today. We would not have developed it to the point at which a society of human cooperation and free access to wealth is a distinct and pretty well immediate possibility. The arguments about human nature always seem to apply as well to acts which are seen as damaging. For example, the police, who are a chief of police or a chief constable, whatever they call themselves, will often declaim about human nature, and he would do that describing a particular type of offence which is perhaps unpleasant, and unpleasant consequences for some people involved in an armed robbery or a particular act of violence or something like that, and they will end up their analysis of this by saying, well, what can you expect? That's human nature, isn't it? But at the same time they will praise perhaps the police officers who are involved, who they say behave bravely, and it never occurs to them that what they're saying is that human beings, at the same time as the behaviour was, according to them, unacceptable, there are other human beings behaving what they said was an acceptable way. But whenever we get examples of constructive and cooperative behaviour, people never say, well, what can you expect? That is just human nature, isn't it? If there is such a thing as human nature, it doesn't exclude cooperation. It's as natural to help as to harm. It's as natural to cooperate as to compete. What we can say about human nature is it is something, or rather human behaviour, which people wrongly classify as human nature. What we can say is that it is a reaction to our condition. The present social system encourages us to be competitive. The role models which it puts forward are not those of cooperation. They're those of acquisitiveness, they're those of destructiveness. You may have seen, I think it was last week, a programme about the Canadians in Bomber Command during the war, when they had these two pilots who went back to visit German cities which they had bombed, and the whole theme of the programme was about the not just the offensive of Bomber Command and what happened, but also the tremendous casualties that they incurred, and the fact that the man in charge, this man Harris, had this mission in life to kill as many Germans as possible, and this was the basis of the Bomber Command offensive. And these two men who piloted bombers were obviously extremely lucky, or perhaps extremely cowardly. They managed to survive an awful lot of raids anyway. They'd gone back to these German cities and they were confronted with some frightful stories. They met the chief of the fire brigade. It was either Hamburg or Cologne, And they met two women who'd lived through the air raids, who told them after an incident about what they'd seen during the air raids. Now, the whole point about this, these two men were heroes. They'd been decorated and they'd come through it all, but they had been involved in the most frightful acts of indiscriminate destruction and killing. Their job was to just wipe out whole areas of human population. But that wasn't considered to be unacceptable behaviour, and that's the sort of standards which capitalism produces in people. Now, what we're talking about is a society of safety. We're talking about human beings having safe conditions. We're talking about a society in which we stand equally about the wealth in society, about access to wealth, and we stand equally about the ownership of the means of wealth production and distribution. Now, that's a safe society. So we argue that in those sort of conditions, safe conditions, human beings are going to act in a safe way. They are going to cooperate. They are going to see cooperation as the highest morality of society. They're going to see caring for each other as the highest morality of society. People offend against the laws of capitalism today, which are represented to them as the high morality, because they are alienated from this society. And it's not difficult to be alienated from capitalism. If you don't come up to the standards of capitalism, then it's very easy to feel that you don't have a place in the society, so that you are going to offend against its morals. A recent study, for example, found that about almost half the people in prison had committed offences linked to excess intake of alcohol or abusing drugs. Now, why do people drink a hell of a lot, and why do people abuse themselves with drugs? The answer is they do that because that's their way of dealing with the problems of capitalist society, and that leads directly to them committing offences, leads to them coming up into court and going into prison. Now, socialist society will not be that sort of society. There's another link which is established, even the police accept this now. There's a link which has been established between unemployment and crime. And, of course, capitalism regards the employed worker as somebody who is being exploited and therefore useful. And if a worker is not employed, is not exploitable and not being exploited, then that worker isn't useful. And so it has to be treated in a particular way. And it's very easy, and this is something which is widespread in this country at the moment, then to feel alienated and despairing and feel that you don't have a place in society. And so it's very easy from that point to feel that you should offend against the requirements of that society. Now, so the laws of capitalism say that theft and violence must be on their terms, and that's typical of the morality which capitalism imposes. We want a different sort of society. We want a society which doesn't just have the state machine, but doesn't have any of the appurtenances as well. We want a society without the state and a society without the laws. But that's not to say that we want a society without its own morality and without its own presumptions. But in a free and safe society where people do stand equally about the basis of our lives, then that's a perfectly possible society, and it's one which we're all working towards. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions to start off discussion? Yeah.
Well, would you speak of visualise this absence of law happening immediately? And for instance, you mentioned young Stephen, I can't remember his second name, who was wrongly convicted of child sexual murder. If this should happen as an example in a social society, how would it be dealt with? Obviously, if you're fostering the idea that these things couldn't possibly happen in a social society, they wouldn't have to be dealt with, we wouldn't have to have any mechanism. But assuming that some of these things may happen, accepting as socialism progresses, there'd be probably less of them. But assuming that there would be some, how would society deal with it? I mean, could it be done in some sort of ad hoc manner, or would it have to be done in a formal way? I mean, could the anti-social people be allowed to roam around at will? I mean, these are real practical problems, right?
Well, I don't have any enormous knowledge about that guy. I think his name's Kiskos, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Kiskos, something like that, yeah. Except that what I do know indicates that he was an example of somebody who was very seriously alienated from the requirements of capitalist society. He didn't come up to anywhere near the prevalent idea of what is an ideal person His family didn't, his background didn't. And it's very difficult to know where people like that begin, because he was educationally not achieving very highly, and he had a few other problems as well. One thing we can be sure of is that somebody in that condition is not dealt with in a constructive way in this society. And this was why the police picked on the guy. He was a loser, he was a victim, and so it was very easy. He was an unpopular person, so it was very easy to pin this offence on him, because nobody was going to stand up and defend this bloke, and even his own defence, legal defence, weren't too interested in it. So, and capitalist society is full of these people, and it's very difficult to say exactly where they begin. We very often see where they end, and what we do know is that they don't fit in with this ideal, and they react in that particular way. So I don't think there will be people exactly like him. Now, I mean, we can't deny, I suppose, the fact that there will be people in socialist society who will act in what you describe as an antisocial way. But they have got to be people who do have quite severe problems. They've got to be people we can say that they'll be ill, and society will deal with them as ill people. If necessary, they would have to be restrained. And we will deal with them as people needing restraint, and then for their problems to be dealt with. What we won't do is to prosecute them. They won't be regarded as people who are offending against society and have to be restrained and punished. They will be dealt with in the same way as socialism will deal with all its other problems. It will deal with problems of natural disasters in exactly the same way. But it's a very interesting point of discussion.
I think somebody at the back.
I was going to ask a very similar question to the first speaker, and one has answered that. I was also going to say that the code or the way of dealing with people in a socialist society who committed a murder, for example, they would obviously we would regard them as being needing treatment of some kind. And surely, if you have a code or a way of dealing with that in a sense, you may not use the word law, but that in a sense would be the equivalent. I'm not comparing it with the law today at all, but that is a law in another sense, isn't it? That way of society of dealing with those people. So you could say, well, that is in fact a law, and you wouldn't use that term.
Well, it's not just a matter of semantics. I mean, the law does have a particular context. Like, law is there on statute, and certain acts are forbidden, and there is a machinery for dealing with them. Socialism will deal with the situation as it is, and it will have what I call its own morality. It will be a morality of cooperation, and it will deal with people who don't. Let's put it this way. I mean, I talked about the industry of the legal profession, didn't I? Now, that's an enormously wasteful industry, and when we look around us, we can see that there's a huge amount of waste in capitalist society. But society accepts that and gets along with it, and is still pretty productive and still develops. So, in socialist society, that waste won't exist. From that point of view, society will be a lot more efficient in all ways. So when it's confronted with minor problems like people behaving in an antisocial way, then it will deal with them in the appropriate way at the time. If necessary, it would restrain them, and if it would treat them as people who need to be helped, need perhaps to be treated. But it would do that without any formal regulations, if you like to say. It would do that without any formal machinery for dealing with them, a formal machinery of the state, a police, a prosecution system, courts to judge whether they did it or not. Because if you talk about laws, then you've got to have a system in which you have to judge whether the person's done it or not. If they deny it, you then get involved in this enormous machinery as we have today, a legal machinery in which one person argues one side of the case and another person argues the other. Perhaps neither of them saying things which they know to be true. Now that sort of thing won't exist in socialist society, but obviously any human society acts on certain presumptions, and the presumptions of socialist society will be that human beings cooperate, and that's the way it will deal with all its problems.
Steve?
I don't agree with the assumption that antisocial behaviour should become in the best of all possible worlds still behave like, well, they've got to be ill. They've got to be crazy. Because I think there's a big problem here, and that is that more damage has been done to human beings in the 20th century in the cause of treatment than in the cause of punishment. And in fact, treatment is the dominant form of punishment in liberal capitalist societies. So I think it's a mistaken view. I also think that if you medicalise antisocial behaviour, the assumption is that you then take away the judicial procedures which allow people to defend themselves. And of course, rightly so, if you're dealing with people who are lunatics, you say, well, we're sane, we recognise what the social expectations are, you're insane. It would be an act of an uncaring act on our part to even allow you to defend yourself. You'll only incriminate yourself more, you'll only make yourself become more foolish. Therefore, we don't even want to hear what you've got to say. We are just going to pursue this form of treatment. I think it's the wrong answer that Ralph has given. And I think it's the wrong answer that is often given. I think you've got to say 2 or 3 things. One, that the number of such cases of antisocial behaviour are going to rapidly diminish, probably beyond the kind of expectations that most people have now, certainly beyond the expectations that both in his question and in previous discussions with him, Frank Simpkins over there has expressed. I mean, I think this is just carrying the expectations of capitalist behaviour into socialism. I think it's an expectation of socialism being simply an economic transformation of society and not a cultural transformation of society. Therefore, the assumption is that although people will recognise that common ownership means that you don't eat all the food and let the children starve, it will mean that you take free access to mean your right to rape people. I don't think any of those cultural traits are going to survive in any reasonable expectation to think that they're going to survive into a socialist society, because that might be called a utopian cop-out. Well, what I'm saying is it won't happen, therefore we don't have to think about it. I'm not saying we don't have to think about it, but I am saying it won't happen. I am saying that I don't think in a socialist society it's reasonable to create problems in our expectations which are not going to be there within the material reality. But the second thing I say is that where antisocial behaviour occurs that people can't put up with, it is extremely important that we recognise the distinction between law, which must be abolished, and judicial procedures which allow people a fair hearing. That, to me, is a paramount element within democracy. And I would want that in a socialist society. And if a socialist society decided to respond to my antisocial behaviour in a particular respect, I would want to be able to do 2 things. To say, A, what you are saying is false, and I can prove it. And I would want not as much right to prove it as I can with the best lawyers and the greatest amount of money under capitalism, but more of a right. And I would also want the opportunity to say, well, actually I did it, but I want you to, as a society, look at it this way and think about it this way. I think that the notion that that kind of thing shouldn't exist, and that actually strays into a more dangerous sort of utopianism. The assumption that there are not going to be arguments, there are not going to be different, that the individual is going to be so integrated into society that if society says to someone like me, we think that for the good of what was in a particular case of literature called the good of the nation, but for the good of the world socialist society, we think you need a bit of medical treatment, old chap. But come back and see us in 10 years' time, and we're sure that your place on the biscuit production line will be fine. I'm not interested in that particular option. I want to argue as much as I can, particularly if I don't think that I am done. And the third response I would make, which I think is away from the medical non-option, I think dangerous option, is this, to say the point about capitalist society is it conceives of problems, antisocial problems in terms of punishment. Punishment belongs to the whole kind of Judeo-Christian thing about blame, attacking people because you've been guilty about, and making people guilty, and so on. The fact of the matter is that what we have at the moment is a society which is not a society. We have a society in the sense that we can only live by being interdependent and cooperative in one sense. But it's not a society because it is constantly urging us not to actually recognise our interdependence and cooperative abilities. Now, in a socialist society, which will be by its very character a society of interrelationship and conscious interrelationship, and that is the key word, conscious interrelationship, in other words, an awareness that people are interrelating, then I think it's not simply the question of what happens to the person who commits the antisocial behaviour, but the rights of the rest of society. And the rights of the rest of society may well be to say, look, we produce all of the food of society. But frankly, if your behaviour is such that, and this really harks back to the first talk of the day, if your behaviour is such that you're really upsetting people and annoying people, we don't want to eat with you. We don't want to share our dwellings with you. We don't want to be involved in entertainment where you're present. I mean, this is in social anthropology a common and effective form of telling people that you don't like certain things. You remove yourself. If enough people remove themselves from you, you start to get the message. I don't think that this is an unreasonable context within which to think about how to solve problems of antisocial behaviour in a socialist society. In other words, you don't imprison a person, because imprisoning a person, pulling them away from society, and incidentally forcing members of society to then become prison guards. And I don't believe that the moment you have your first socialist prison guard, however well reasoned incidentally the argument for the prison guard, however much it is constructed within the terms of democracy and compatibility with socialism, there's one thing you've left out of account in that scenario, and that is that prison guard will be a prison guard with a socialist conscience and an awareness of society, and she will be involved in free access and love for other people and all the rest of it for 5 minutes. And on the second day of their job, they will be an authoritarian bastard. Because being a prison guard is not a neutral occupation, and you couldn't do it without that happening. That is the nature of these institutions. Therefore, instead of imprisoning the wrongdoer and thereby imprisoning other members of society who have to be part of the prison, you do the other thing. Society removes itself from those people. Always going back to the second point of saying, let those people have the maximum opportunities, if necessarily with informal arrangements, of defending, explaining, expressing remorse, and so on. And also within the context of the first point that I suggested, which is you don't ever, in my view, in a socialist society, I think the very notion of talking about any person being so ill that they are incapable of being part of society, I just don't think it's for 1 minute acceptable. I think it's actually a spin-off of eugenics. And I think that if you start to talk about these people who are only ever criminal because there's something wrong with their mind, then you've got a big problem in terms of Marxist theory, because the mind is a social phenomenon, as we all know, which only exists within the context of the environment within which it lives. Therefore, if there's something wrong with a person's mind, the best thing to do within the context of punishment would be to punish society, not to punish the individual. So I don't think illness is the answer. Now, having said, I don't know whether Ralph really holds that view about illness, or whether it is a sort of a euphemism for not wanting a legal solution, which I don't want. I don't want a society of law at all. But I would rather live, actually, in a society where I could go to a court, employ a lawyer, or get legal aid, than be in a society run by psychiatrists who are the most pernicious and evil people that modern culture has created.
Part of that. Slightly related to some of those points, but perhaps experience. So this is part question, part statement. What's intriguing me about this is the concept or concepts, the nest of concepts of human nature that exist in capitalism. And they seem to me to be very important to this whole business of upholding the law. For example, if I get down to the nitty-gritty, it's only possible to be a policeman and to work effectively if you've got a concept of human nature which will allow you to do your job. You therefore have to divide human beings into people and toe rags if you're a policeman. You talk socially, you mix with policemen, and you will find that comes out in the first 5 minutes. They will suss people up, they will always find them watching you, and they will have you in one of those two categories. He's a person, that's a toe rag. And a toe rag you can do anything. And this is quite interesting, it seems to me, in that it bears upon the talk that Karima was doing this morning about the indigenous populations. If you're walking in gosh, I need to think of the blooming African forests where the pygmies are. But
Congo? Cameroon.
Congo. Yeah. Congo Basin. Yeah, that's right. Yes, I was getting mixed up between the Amazon Basin and the Congo Basin. You come across across a woodland path, and the pygmies are saying, don't come across. Who don't come across? On people don't come across, like Negroes. They have the people and toe rag attitude. That's to say, who's in and who's out. So it's not purely a civilised thing. This has been going on a long, long time, and you will find if you look at society papers like Queen, for example, when it talks about people, who's people? People like us. We're people, and them. So I think the concepts of what constitutes a person is very important in this question of law and criminalisation. But the point I really want to get round to and really ask a question about here is, it has struck me as an impression. For example, in going into a prison and the prison officer said, well, this lot are inadequates. I said, well, exactly what do you mean by inadequates? Oh, well, he left his wife and then got hauled up before the court, and he was supposed to pay alimony and he didn't, and he lost his job, and he couldn't pay the fines, and so he eventually finishes up here. Now that's category D prison, you see, which is almost full of inadequates according to capitalism. And that they become criminals. And it seems to me that one of the things about them, this is the question I'm asking, is that what they can't handle is not life. They're not with life all right, but they couldn't handle with capitalism. And we've had members in this party, I won't name any names, but at one level extremely charming people, very kind, their friends and so on, very generous, but always in trouble with the law. What they can't handle is property relations. If they feel like a fag, and they haven't got a fag, they'll pass by a boob and pick a packet of fags up. Which seems to me to be an eminently sensible way to behave at one level, but of course it can't. Now, is that simply my impression, that some of these people wouldn't have a moment's trouble in a socialist society. And it's only capitalism they can't. Or am I fantasising a bit?
If you want
I've been putting the question to Ralph. I mean, it seems people who get in trouble with the law, that's all.
Well, I did indicate that when I used the word alienation. The prison officer used the term inadequate. He must have been on a training course recently. They don't usually have such subtle attitudes, but it's absolutely true, and this is continually publicised, isn't it? There was a governor of Pentonville once who said if I opened the gates here, half of the prisoners would not walk out because life in Pentonville is a lot better than life out in the Caledonian Road. And that was a sort of perhaps a slight overstatement of reality. It is. Quite a lot of people find going to prison a relief. They can't hang capitalism to such an extent that they find it really quite a relief to go to somewhere where they're told what to do from the moment they get up in the morning to the moment they go to bed at night. And no other decisions have to be taken. They don't have any of the other problems of being a member of the working class and coming out and handling things. They don't have the problem of nicking fags as they go past a tobacconist, and they have a completely different sort of attitude towards the immediate everyday living. So it is absolutely true that prisons are full of this sort of person. Occasionally this is publicised and then people begin to question the function of prisons, but it never develops, because when those people come before courts, of course, the courts don't look at it in that. They say you've offended against the law and you've stolen so many packets of cigarettes. I came across a bloke recently who was imprisoned in Iraq and tortured, and came to this country as a political refugee, and because of his circumstances here and his concern about his family in Iraq, he got into using drugs, and so he steals in order to buy drugs. So he continually steals. He goes to supermarkets, he sort of blitzes like King Street Hammersmith, and if he's lucky that day he gets away with the blitz. If he's unlucky, he gets picked up on the 4th or 5th shot, and eventually courts run out of patience with him, so they send him to prison. And this is a guy who can't handle, and who can blame him, who can ask. I mean, this is sort of impinging a bit on what Steve was saying, that I was coming to later on, but who can criticise or be surprised at somebody who can't handle that type of experience and react in that way? People can't deal with capitalism. It's not a society that answers our needs, and I think it's, in a way, it's a much healthier reaction to the conditions of capitalism than to accept it and to be compliant to it. People who behave like that are far more damaged, and in prison as well. The healthier prisoners are those who resist it, resist the regime in some sort of way. The unhealthiest prisoners, the people who do like to go out, the people who don't walk out of Pentonville if they open the gates, are the people who accept the regime and find actual comfort there.
Sandy.
I would start off by agreeing with largely the first point that Steve made, that it's been very dangerous indeed I remember when I did a year of philosophy at university, one of the questions I was asked in the end of year exams, there was a quote given: criminals are sick, they should be sent to hospital, not to prison. Well, for some reason this immensely irritated me on that particular day. I went right over the top in my answer to it. I said it was a load of rubbish, it was an insult to the dignity of man, as I put it at the time, and so on. But I think that was essentially right. I mean, I should perhaps have controlled my emotions a bit in answer to the question, but... And there's another rather strange example I would like to give you. I think I've given this in a meeting before. One of the Russian authors in the last century wrote a story, and it was adapted as a Radio 4 play. I don't know whether the original name of the story was retained in the play, but the play was called Men, Not Sparrows. And basically it was about these serfs on a farm which had the misfortune to be sold to a, quote, liberal owner. And he said he was going to reform the forms of punishment. So that instead of whipping them when they did wrong, when they offended against the sort of rules of the farm, he tied them to a thread. He tied a thread round them and tied it to this post or whatever, and forbade them to go to go anywhere beyond the restrictions of the thread. And they felt immensely insulted by this. They would have preferred the whipping, because at least they would have been being treated like human beings, rather than like some sort of bird or animal that needed to be tied up. And that's hardly the sort of end of the story. The point that was being made is right, that to treat people in that kind of patronising way, which is involved in this idea of medical treatment for antisocial behaviour, is just not the answer. You've at least got to assume that they have some responsibility for their actions, or are capable of realising that if they've committed an antisocial act, that's what they've done and what are they going to do about it. And it brings me on to what Ralph was saying about treating problems like this in much the same way as you would treat natural disasters. Now, he didn't go into that, and it might sound to some people like a bit of an oversimplification, but that's also a point that's worth making. Socialism is going to have problems to deal with, and there will be various types of problems, but there is no reason why, an explosion in a factory, a road accident, and some kind of antisocial behaviour cannot all be broadly dealt with in the same way. That's to say, you find out what happened and who was involved, and you see what can be done about it. Those are the broad principles, and you don't need to talk about law in this circumstance any more than you need to talk about law when it comes to the principles of democratic procedure. These things are pretty well understood by most people. We can have arguments about them and how they apply in particular circumstances, but none of us need to, look up a bloody law book to say, right, well, according to the laws of democratic procedure, this is what you do. You can talk about rules of democratic procedure, principles of democratic procedure. Why do we need to use the word law? Why do we need to assume that people have got to be put on trial? I mean, after all, a legal trial is little better than trial by ordeal in a kind of sophisticated form. That's really what it is. And we want to get past that in our dealings with human beings and with the problems that come up. You've got to assume in the first instance that people are pretty well responsible to some degree or other for the actions that they take. And if they take actions which offend against other people, then you've got to try and find out as much about that as possible. And the big mistake that's made by people when they talk about law is, of course, this idea that the law is neutral and that it should be a separate sort of course in society, apart from the normal decision-making procedures. I don't see that that's necessary at all. You can have specialised mechanisms for dealing with particular problems without having to consider them as being apart from and somehow, way up in space, higher than the normal decision-making procedures. And it's not so much a question of neutrality. I mean, money is neutral. The law as we have it at the moment pretends to be neutral, which is simply another way of saying different at the very best. But the concept of fairness is the far more important one for socialists, it seems to me. So I think we can quite realistically talk about a society without law, which is, however, an ordered society, which can have broad principles and specific procedures where necessary. And, well, it may be necessary to restrict some people's liberty in some form or other, but you would still do it within as humane a situation as possible, and giving the people concerned the permanent right to argue with you about it. You've got to assume that unless there is overwhelming evidence to the contrary, most people know what they're doing most of the time, and that all of us can get into situations where we lose the kind of normal control of it. Well, that doesn't mean that we'll become ill. It simply means that a temporary imbalance is set in, if we put it like that.
Okay. I make it just gone 10 to 1. I think we'll have to finish quite promptly at 1 because I assume the food will be ready then. Okay, Cliff.
Yeah, I want to talk about a very important area of guilt and shame. It's been touched upon. And because I've heard some notions before about if people will contribute in the social society towards the common work effort or whatever, what we need to do is shame them, make them feel guilty, and to contribute. And I think this is maybe a lack of understanding of human nature and the recognition that it's part of the human condition to want to contribute and to want to belong in the community is a constant. And if they don't make their contribution, to respond to that by looking upon them in a devalued way, shunning them, isolating yourself from them, just increases the distance which they're feeling anyway because they're not contributing in the first place. I think what we need to do is to be even more friendly towards them, still sharing what we have with them, and to look upon them as our social equals and friends. I think there's aspects of so-called guilt tripping which go on now. I think we need to change our behaviour now as socialists and set sort of like an example. And I myself try not to look upon people who behave in ways which I would rather they didn't behave. I look upon them still as friends and equals. And I think nobody can send anybody else on a guilt trip anyway. I think we send ourselves on a guilt trip because we say, right, I've done something wrong, and I'm responsible for doing it. That's a rational thing to say. And then an irrational thing comes in, and we say, well, I'm a no good for nothing, devalued person for doing it. And this stems back from the whole original sin concept, which we have to get rid of. We have to start practicing more rational behaviour now, rather than waiting for socialism to come along. We need to say, right, I've done something wrong, committed an antisocial act, and I'm responsible for doing it. Now, how do I not commit that act again? And the whole emphasis is upon proceeding in a positive direction instead of being bogged down in negative guilt. And you think to yourself, as a compensation, well, I feel bad enough about myself. I've committed this sin, but I'm not really a baddie because I feel so, remorseful about it and bad and yet that doesn't do anything towards making yourself more competent and more able not to commit the antisocial act again.
Very good point.
And I think we've only got 5 minutes. I don't know if Ralph wants to sum up, so if you don't mind, Frank, Carl.
I'd just like to say, this sounds so genteel here to what I'm used to when you hear discussions on crime, where you pick up the daily paper and you read about drive-by shootings, 16-year-olds with machine guns. And there's a joke now in the United States because there's so many disgruntled workers that are going in and shooting the supervisor, everybody in the room, in the post office. So if you see the flag flying at half-mast over a post office, you know they're hiring. It's almost novel to hear how you excuse and so on. The prison population is doubling every 7 years. And if capitalism continues for many more years in the United States, I don't know how you would deal with it. It'd be a monumental task with the youngsters growing up today. One man in Washington said not too long ago, if we want to go to the White House, we'll have to go there in an armored car. Because 2 blocks from the White House, there's shootings every night. And this is the state of social disintegration that's going on in the United States. It's the number 1 capitalist country in the world. So, at the end of the line, it boggles the mind, how you would get these victims of capitalism and try and that be brought up from childhood in this rapacious society. How you ever turn around, I don't know. Steve, we need to go over that.
Do you want to sum up?
Well, I just should.
We've got about 3 minutes until lunchtime, so if you don't mind, Frank, unless it's very brief,
Well, I do really
because
think the party's not facing this issue, like many other issues, seriously. We appear naive and absolutely utopian. But you didn't answer the first question, Ralph, about whether the law would be abolished immediately. Self-evidently it couldn't, because, as our American comrade pointed out, how the antisocial behaviour, which is all pervasive, particularly in some countries, or largely pervasive, wouldn't just end just like that. We don't go through a dawn in a social society. As a continuation of patterns, and maybe we would have to face it.
Yeah, I think
society developed, and this antisocial behaviour diminished substantially over decades. It was still have to be faced initially, and even in a fully fledged society, if there's gross antisocial behaviour, although a lot less than now, it would have to be dealt with, and be dealt with in an above a form of fashion, not ad hoc. It has to be done with the pros and cons of evidence.
Okay, well, if you don't mind, I'll stop you there, because I think we all know what you're saying, and the place for discussing that's probably party conference, as it has been before, and I'm sure will be again. So I'd like to ask Ralph if you want to sum up briefly.
I'm sorry, I completely forgot about whether would the law be abolished immediately, or whether there would be this sort of transition period when we would have the law. But I find that quite inconceivable that when socialism is established, society has taken the step of establishing socialism and still keeps courts and prisons and police officers and lawyers going. The point I was trying to make, but Sandy made it in a much more concise way, I made it in a very clumsy way, was that any minorities who do behave in an antisocial way in socialist society would be regarded much the same way as natural disasters, as problems which society has to face. If there are people who behave in that way, I wouldn't regard them as any great problem. I would think if they would be a minority, but an extremely small minority, because most of the offences which are committed in society today, and some of them do have some pretty dreadful consequences for other people, don't just come out of the blue. People don't wake up one morning and decide they're going to go out and shoot one or two people and rob a bank. There's a considerable background to it, and that background is rooted in property society. I can't share what I would say call Steve's optimism that socialism will be completely free of people who behave in ways which are seen as antisocial, and I think we'd be very unwise to take that stance. When I use the term treatment, of course, I wasn't talking about what's called treatment today. The fact of the matter is that there is no treatment today, even in these special hospitals like Broadmoor and Ashworth, where they get people who have committed extremely serious offences, and they are supposed to be treated. They're called patients, and they don't have prison uniform, and they're looked after by people who are called nurses. The treatment there is simply non-existent, and if they ever emerge into society, they come out in roughly the same state as they went in. When I said treatment, I really did mean treatment. In other words, individuals being, first of all, valued as members of society, and they will be dealt with in the same way as other problems by a society that is cooperative and humane in its approach to these things. I think the problem with the case about having law courts, and Fred made this point as well as Steve, when we're talking about things being judged on evidence, is that if you ever sit in a court of law and listen to evidence, what immediately comes over is that courts, that sort of procedure doesn't get at what you might call truth. It doesn't get at facts. It assesses evidence, and that's an extremely different matter. If we get involved in that sort of thing, then we're going up a very difficult and problem-scattered road. I think that's all I've got to say at the moment, except that I think it would be very unwise to say that socialism is going to be a problem-free society. We don't know exactly why human beings behave in that particular way. There might be just a very few people in socialist society who would behave in ways which would be seen to be unacceptable, and I think we ought to face that and deal with it as a possible problem.